Chapter 46. Not Alone. Gavin awoke with a gasp, sitting up slightly and looking at Peake standing over him, then to the drip in his arm. He slowly moved as if to try to take it out, probably still confused after what he'd been through, thinking he was still at the mercy of the randoms. He swayed and slumped back, Peake's hand gently pressing him back to lie down. "We're putting it back in. You still need blood," Peake explained. "Huh?" Gavin blinked a few times, still looking around confused. "You're putting it back?" "Just needed your heart to be pumping for that to work." "Did I? I died." Gavin's voice was thick, weighted with lethargy and confusion. Peake was unfazed. "Kind of." A funny sort of amused grin came over Gavin's face, not the kind you'd expect from someone being told they'd just cheated death. He snorted a giggle and muttered, "Maybe not, Ray. Not quite." "Ray?" Ryan looked at Jeremy, then Michael. Jeremy mustn't have heard him, or not picked up on it, but Michael looked heartbroken. It took a few moments for Ryan to make the connection, but when he did, it hit him like a hammer. "Tell Vav I said YOLO." Ray's dying words. Michael finally relaxed and laid back down on the next cot over. "Jesus, Gavin, please. I've said it before, but please, never scare me like that again." "Sorry, boy. Didn't mean to do you frighten," Gavin said dopily, rolling his head sideways to look at him. Michael slowly smiled and giggled, some color returning to his cheeks. "You did, Gav. You did me a frighten." The relief in his voice was clear. Ryan finally allowed himself a moment's pause to take stock of his own injuries. He immediately noticed the pain in his side. Not that it had gone anywhere, and it definitely didn't feel like it had subsided at all, but he'd been able to deprioritize it. That wasn't an option anymore, and he leaned back with a groan, moving his hand away from the wound to reveal probably a lot more blood than anyone had been expecting, himself included. "Oh," he said simply, a few heads turning to look as he nudged Jeremy out of the way slightly to lie back on the cot, instantly feeling the combined effects of shock and sleep deprivation, his vision growing hazy and filling with swimming black dots. "Ryan? Help! Someone!" Jeremy's voice faded out with the rest of the world as he slipped into some place between existing and nothingness. It was peaceful for a moment, but when he returned, it was too bright, light, and pain. "Ah, yes, this seems familiar," the voice in his head taunted. "The sweet sting of failure." "Hardly a failure. We still got everyone. We got the boys back." He hadn't let his need for revenge get the better of him. He easily could have chased after the skull-faced random when Jeremy took off after, but instead he'd opted to get Michael and Gavin out. That was a step in the right direction. It nearly cost Jeremy. If he'd chased her down, he might not have gotten shot. There was no way to know that. I did the best I could with what I had. He looks up to you, poor dumb kid. If he hadn't been wearing armor. Don't do this. Snap out of it, Hayward. We're fine. Everyone's okay. But for how long? Well, that was always the question, wasn't it? For now. The first real voice Ryan heard was Jeff's, and it made him blink and squint to try to refocus his eyes, but they refused, so he let them fall shut again and just listened. He couldn't quite make out what Jeff was saying. He felt a gentle tugging at his left side, followed by a sting and more tugging. Someone was stitching his wound. They must have given him something for the pain. While it still hurt, it wasn't anywhere near as bad as it should have been. "Ryan, we got you, buddy." Jeremy's voice sounded muffled again. "Chumbawamba." Ryan smiled with a recognition, but before he knew it, he was out once more. It was dark and cool when Ryan woke again. It was like everything had the volume turned down. The pain was still present, but mild. His head still chattered away, but it was in hushed whispers now. All the hard edges seemed softer. Morphine was a wonderful thing sometimes. He opened his eyes and blinked a few times, letting his eyes adjust. He wasn't in the makeshift medical center anymore. Soft moonlight flooded through a large, dusty window, illuminating what looked like a large bedroom. almost dorm-like, with 5 beds along one wall and one more at the far end against the opposite wall nearest the door. Yellow light spilled through the door that had been left ajar, and Ryan could hear soft voices nearby. From the outside, the camp had looked like it was in total disrepair, but inside, everything so far seemed highly livable. It was a great cover. To his right, a germy-sized lump occupied the bed next to him, while to his left, a mop of Michael's unkempt auburn hair stuck out from under the blanket, and in the bed next over, Gavin was curled up like a cat and making some kind of not quite snoring, humming noises. The far beds were empty, but the sheets were disturbed, probably where Jeff and Jack had been sleeping, if they could even sleep. He had half a mind to get up and try to find them, find out what had happened, but he wasn't sure his body could physically handle it. He felt that uncomfortable sense of uselessness that he'd become familiar with while he was cooped up in the penthouse, starting to eat away at him again. He sternly reminded himself there was nothing more to be done for it, and thankfully the voice of protest was too sleepy in his head to put up much resistance. Next to him, Michael stirred, pulling the blankets down and rolling onto his side to face Ryan. He looked exhausted and sickly pale, but he smiled to see Ryan awake. "Hey, Rybread." "Hey," he croaked back. "You look like shit. Have you slept?" "Hey, thanks, man." Michael made an attempt to shrug. "It depends on how you define sleep." "Have you heard from Lindsay? She was with Jeff. Is everything okay?" "Yeah," Michael smiled. "She was with the others someplace safe." Gavin was still making quiet whimpering noises, and Ryan peered over Michael's shoulder to see him twitch. "How's Gavin?" "He's hanging in there. He's tougher than we give him credit for." He said it with a sad smile and more than hint of affection in what Ryan recognized as pride. "Lil Jay's doing fine as well. Everyone's okay." Ryan looked at him skeptically. "How are you holding up?" Michael sighed. "Honestly, not great." Ryan cringed. "You heard what Gavin said?" Michael nodded and blinked hard a few times, as if discouraging tears. "I thought it was going to happen again. I thought I was going to have to watch Gavin die." He let out a long, shaky sigh and rolled onto his back. "I was fucking scared." Ryan nodded. Ray had died in Michael's arms. How close had he come to have that happen again? Michael was usually protective of Gavin. The two were virtually inseparable as it was, but after Ray's death, Michael had been constantly vigilant. What Ryan had gone through was one thing, but to be taken with someone who could be used against you? To watch them suffer with you? Things could have gone so much worse. Ryan didn't envy his position. "It's okay." Ryan remembered what Jeff had said to him after everything. He didn't feel like he could be as supportive. He felt just as lost himself. "You don't have to be okay." "Good, because I'm not," Michael snapped abruptly, causing Gavin to stir slightly. He waited until Gavin settled again before he went on, glaring at Ryan. "You're about to start doing that thing again, I can tell." "What thing?" Ryan asked, taken a little aback. "You're the biggest hypocrite sometimes, Ryan." "What did I do?" Michael shook his head. "You act like it's okay to talk about it and never say anything yourself. It's always, 'I'm fine,' with you, even when you're clearly not fine." Ryan bit his lip and looked away before a sad kind of smirk crossed his face. "Look, sometimes it's just a case of do what I say, not what I do." Michael breathed a laugh and shook his head. "Well, at least I'm not going anywhere." There's a trace of contempt in his voice. "Why did you leave? You didn't say anything." Ryan chewed his lip again. "Jeff didn't show you the report?" Michael nodded. "Yeah, but that shit wasn't your fault. You didn't have to leave." Ryan ran a hand over his face, only just now realizing his face paint had been washed off. "Yeah, I did. I can't control what's going on in my head sometimes. Shadles had the same thing. He shot his partner for it, and I stabbed Jeremy. He said we weren't so different. He sounded hurt. He was right. No, he wasn't. Jeff's voice came from the doorway, just loud enough for them to hear him without disturbing Gavin. Jack was standing just behind him. Jeff? Ryan asked, waiting for clarification. Jeff stepped inside and sat on the end of one of the empty beds. The report was a fake. It was a deliberate attempt to get to you. They had profilers make up some bullshit to try to fuck with your head and throw us off the track. How do you... Ryan started, but Jeff cut him off. I'll tell you everything all together in the morning. I don't want to repeat myself 50 fucking times, so get some sleep. But in the morning, Ryan. Ryan huffed but lay back, folding his arms behind his head and staring up at the ceiling. Forged. To fuck with him. It asked more questions than it answered, but it also took some of the pressure off. Something else was going on. It didn't change any of what had happened, but maybe it helped make some sense of it. He was just thinking he might never be able to get to sleep when his eyelids drooped shut and he drifted off. The next morning, the Cult of Peak members had prepared a breakfast of eggs, oats, and fruit, which seemed to be their staple diet. The crew were left alone, seated around a large wooden table in the same cabin they had slept in, most of them on their second helping of breakfast and painfully disappointed at the lack of caffeinated beverages. All of them were shaken, bruised, and sore, but rested and grateful to be alive. Gavin and Michael were both still very pale. Feel hungover, Gavin complained. It's awful. Michael nodded. Helps to eat something, Gav. Gavin scowled and stirred the oats distastefully, but eventually gave in and ate them. Ryan was agitated. His stitches itched, and he was preoccupied thinking about what Jeff had said during the night. Peak was pretty worried about your kidneys, Ryan, Jack explained. Couldn't find any signs of damage, but still, if you find yourself pissing blood at any stage, that's something you should get checked out. Ryan frowned. I'll keep that in mind. Yeah, Jeremy added between bites of apricot. Looked like the little fucker who stabbed you was really gunning for him. Ryan was a little confused, poking at the tear where the knife had slashed his still bloody t-shirt. He could probably stitch that up, to see the bandaged area where he'd been stabbed. It took him a moment to realize why that sounded both funny and familiar. Oh yeah, he laughed. Joke's on them. I don't have a left kidney. It was met with confused looks and blank faces. What do you mean you don't have a left kidney? Jack asked incredulously. Gavin looked confused. Can you live with just one kidney? Gee, what do you think, Gavin? Michael asked in frustration. I mean, apparently you can, Ryan said, raising his eyebrows, but taking pity on Gavin as he laughed at his own stupidity. How is it that we've known you for so long, and yet we're still finding out new things about you? Jeff asked, looking completely puzzled. Ryan shrugged. It's never come up. Gavin and Jeremy giggled, and Jeff and Michael shook their heads in unison. Anyway, we're all still here, Jeff announced, and more or less in one piece. The proverbial cockroaches that we are, Ryan interrupted, despite their best attempts so far to get to us. And I have a feeling it's not going to be their last. These guys are more determined than ever, and I think we might finally be able to get an idea of what's going on. First of all, fill us in on what we missed, Michael said, pushing his now empty bowl away from him and leaning back. Last thing I remember, Gavin and I went out and got jumped, and suddenly Ryan's back, and we can't go home. Jeff, Jack, and Jeremy tag-team telling the story, filling Michael and Gavin in on the events leading up to their rescue. Michael was understandably less than impressed to hear of Lindsay's involvement, especially in a role that essentially boiled down to bait. Look, it was her idea, Jeff insisted. Of course it was. Michael rolled his eyes, but he meant it genuinely. Jeff had already explained she was fine and back with the rest of the support crew, working out what their next move was. Anyway, we played along and went to the rendezvous point. Most of their firepower was concentrated there. This time, it was more than a few ragtag ex-gang members. Their guys seemed almost military. Could have been mercenaries, but maybe some other kind of training. But you'll never fucking guess who else was there. Who? Ryan asked without hesitation. Shadle's brother. Jeff said flatly. Fucker lied to us, or didn't lie to us, or whatever. Point is, he does have a twin, and he's still alive and involved in all of this somehow. He faked his death, and his brother wasn't in on it, left him thinking we were responsible. Made him think he was crazy. Shadles didn't have whatever it was they said he had. They planted forged records. Still have no idea how they'd managed to do that. Ryan's mind raced. So how much had been a lie? He had a brother, he'd faked his death, been completely erased from the system, managed to get forged records back into LSPD hands for Adam to get them back to him, and then what? What was the next step there? He shivered as he recalled his initial reaction to the report, when Jeff had found him that evening on top of the maze bank. They had almost won then. If Jeff hadn't arrived when he did. They had a big team ready to put up a fight. Looks like we were right to call it how we did, which also means they know we wouldn't give up Lindsay without a fight. Goddamn right, Michael snorted in agreement. Ryan felt like he'd glossed over something important, but he was too shaken to focus on it. Digging would have to wait. Gavin pushed on. So that was your plan? Just the two of you walked blindly into a trap? Pretty much, Jeff smirked. We needed to see what we were up against. Remember, the first time we encountered them, they couldn't work together. Our strength was our teamwork. This was different. The guys that were waiting for Lindsay, waiting for us to try to take them head on, they knew what the fuck they were doing. Even had jammers to block our comms. Our strength this time was that we got the drop on them. They weren't expecting the extended family. They were prepared for an ambush, not an extraction. The team at the storage shed were mercenaries, Michael noted, nodding. They were saying how we inspired them. They were probably hired for the same reason. This time we were supposed to be meeting them on their terms. That's why the mercenaries. Back at the warehouse, it was probably a last-minute scramble. They probably weren't ready for Ryan to get caught, Jeremy observed, cringing a little at how bluntly the last part came out. Luckily, we were still one step ahead of them this time because of the tracking chips. Michael held up his bandaged arm where Peake's team must have removed the chip the day before. Just remember that's not an option anymore, okay? But it was just luck, Ryan reiterated, following Jeremy's logic. We're going to have to be a lot more careful from here on out. The others all nodded in agreement. Jeff slapped the table. Well, the good news is the network's functional and the family came through. That was one hell of a trust exercise, Jeff. Jack shook his head. Jeff snorted. Fucking tell me about it. I hope the Cow Chop boys didn't have too much trouble with the cops. Wait, the cops got involved? Jeremy's eyes narrowed. They never get involved in shit like this. Not when it's so far out of the city. You've made some very powerful enemies, and they have a lot of friends. The random's words sprung to Ryan's mind. They would have had to be bloody quick to respond to, Gavin pointed out. Jack nodded, and they weren't messing around. They had attack choppers up there. Jeremy and Michael both tried to talk over the top of each other, and Ryan temporarily lost focus on the conversation, trying to collate his thoughts into something coherent. They'd been able to get into the LSPD records. They were more organized, hired mercenaries, the cops had gotten involved, and not deterred them in the slightest. Ryan leaned into the table with both elbows, massaging his temples with his fingertips. Again, the random's words resonated in his head. You've made some very powerful enemies, and they have lots of friends. What if somehow they had some kind of immunity? What if that's why the cops were getting involved? If the gang was truly random, that wouldn't be possible. So, hear me out on this, Ryan reasoned aloud, interrupting the conversation, but feeling the nagging sensation he was onto something. The others fell silent. Usually an opening line like that was the start of bad ideas, but they were willing to listen to anything at this stage. They hire mercenaries. They infiltrate the LSPD to plant forged records, Ryan explained. That means they're not headless after all. There has to be some method, something that directs them, unites them. They had to start somewhere. Like, kind of like Fight Club. Fight Club? Jeremy raised an eyebrow. Please tell me you've seen Fight Club. Jeff rolled his eyes at him. I have seen Fight Club, Jeremy assured him. It's a great example, Ryan explained. One guy starts it, says to keep it quiet, first rule of Fight Club and all that. Doesn't spread it actively, just plants the seed. After a while, there are clubs all over the country, and then it doesn't take long before they go from a place to take out your frustrations by beating the shit out of some guy you barely know, to waging class warfare and coordinated attacks bringing down financial institutions. Jack nodded. You're right. This isn't a flash mob anymore. This is Project Mayhem. Shadles was Robert Paulson. His name was Robert Paulson. Jeremy, Michael, and Gavin muttered in eerie, almost unison. So who the fuck is behind this then? Michael wondered. Shadles? Gavin suggested hesitantly. His brother? Nah. This is bigger than them. They're there for the same reason as the rest of them. Like those randoms were rejected, they have a personal vendetta. Ryan answered, reasonably confident in his assessment. No. Whoever wants us out of this city more than anyone. Who's always wanted us dead? Who's never been able to do it? Jeff asked, the look on his face suggesting he'd already figured out the answer. Everyone? Jack answered. The fucking cops. It took a moment to sink in. What if it's come from within the system itself? Jeff reasoned. Turn the gags in on one another. Use them to take each other down. Give them enough information to do some actual damage. They don't have to act within the law anymore. They don't have to worry about protecting their image. We gotta get that through to Lindsay. Get him to start digging into the LSPD files, Michael said. Ryan piped up. I can get in contact with Ellis. He should be able to. He's dead, Ryan, Jeff said flatly. I'm sorry. To everyone's surprise, Ryan laughed and shook his head. I'll believe it when I see it. Takes a lot to kill Gilby. More than they've got. The doubt didn't register until he'd finished his sentence, but he still wasn't convinced. Adam wouldn't go down that easily. He was clever. He'd have an out, maybe hit up Joel if he was still around. He hoped. Jeff nodded. The others looked worried, as if Ryan might be entering some new stage of denial, but no one said anything. Only Jeremy looked like he believed there was any truth to his words. All right, well, it's a start. Obviously, there's not much we can do until you lot are back on your feet, but I feel like we can lay low here for a while, as long as Funhouse will have us. Jeff paused, scratching his head. If anything, this has made it clear we're not alone in this anymore. We have backup. Funhouse saved our asses, Jeremy noted. Jeff nodded. They're part of the family now. The family? Michael raised an eyebrow. We're sticking with that. We're going full Sopranos these days, huh? Kind of, Jeff conceded. Funhouse is on our side. They're honorary fakes now. Fake house, Jack pointed out. Yeah, fake house. But also, you guys know the attack gang, the cow shop crew, and maybe even the kind of funny boys will be watching our backs. There are a few others who have said they'll lend a hand if we ever need it to. That's one hell of a network, Ryan admitted with a smirk. Jeff grinned back quite proudly. It's quite the extended family, yeah. They let everything sink in for a few minutes, staring pensively at their food, looking around at each other, considering what everything meant for the future of the crew. Also, Ryan's back, Michael pointed out matter-of-factly with a grin. Ryan shrugged. Seems so.